Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, Chief Storymaker and your host of this podcast. We share stories for many reasons. We want to persuade, we want to entertain, and we want to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're sharing them with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into lessons from each of those stories. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? Well, when I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, but not to respond necessarily. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories, and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way.
Zach Messler, I am so happy to have you on my podcast today. What a treat. So I asked you to be on my podcast today, partly because I knew that we would have some funny stories to share. And so it was mostly a matter of trying to figure out what themes to cover. Like, how do I make this fit into the podcast? Because I know we'll have funny stories to share. So I would love to start off the podcast by asking you to share something about yourself that most people don't know. And the purpose behind that is to give our listeners a little insight into who you are so they'll feel more engaged, more connected as you tell your story, so they'll know more about you.
Sure. Well, I'm jumping out of my skin. This is great, Sarah. I'm so happy to finally be doing this. So much fun. So, I like to put myself out there and like to kind of be the center of attention. It's fun. I dig that. But when I was a kid, I was super shy. That never, ever, ever was me. I was scared to be in front of an audience. I was scared. I'd be terrified going back 20, 30 years, maybe not 20, but 30 years to do this. It would be, oh my goodness, no way. But I was dared. My senior year of high school, I was dared to try out for a one-act play. And in our high school, they had a contest. It was every grade level, so 9th through 12th, put on a one-act play. And the winner of the competition, whichever play that the audience thought was the best, went on and competed in a competition at a playhouse in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, the Bucks County Playhouse. So I went to school in southern New Jersey. So I tried out and I got a part and I was scared out of my mind. But I threw myself into it, and it was an ensemble type play. I was Prometheus. It was the story of Prometheus. And I played Apollo, the god of whatever, fire, war, one of those things. I played a flamingo who was on the jury. I played all these different characters. And what I found when I got up on stage, all those nerves turned into energy, and I loved it. And I finally started to break out of my shell. But before then, I was super quiet and super shy and didn't really give people a chance to know me.
Till your senior year of high school?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I would not have guessed that it was that late into your life. I guess it shouldn't surprise me, though, because a lot of the people I know who are really dynamic, particularly when they're speaking or doing events or whatever, are shy or were shy at some point in their lives. I know I was very quiet, and until you got me talking, of course, because I could yammer for hours. But in class, I didn't speak up. I definitely was more shy. It's definitely more shy than my baby sister. We would be out and about, and my mom would say something to my sister like, "You guys should sing something." She would talk about us like we should sing something in harmony. And I would just absolutely refuse. And my sister would be like, "Okay." So she'd just start singing. And I remember being a little embarrassed and really shy and didn't have any confidence when it came to that. And now, people say, "Oh, sing something." I'm like, "Okay." So I just start singing. But I was shy too. So I guess it shouldn't surprise me, but it does a little bit. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, sure.
So as I was toying with themes for our podcast recording, one thing kept popping into my head, and that was our shared culture and how that has impacted our relationship and the relationships of our network as a result of that. And it comes partly back to your first article about the No Longer Virtual Conference, the first one in 2017 in Atlanta. And it was a week after the conference, and it had been so sticky that people were still talking about it and reliving it. And your article was, I came for content, I left with a tribe. And one of our NLV people the next year mentioned that she was interested in hearing how that came about, the word tribe, the way we were using the NLV tribe. She was curious about how that came about. And I had to think back on the fact that this is part of our culture, yours and mine, as being Jews. And we talk about tribal relations all the time in the context of Judaism. And so that got me thinking about our theme for today about how our culture impacts our communication. And it doesn't have to be the religious culture. It could be a culture of dog lovers. It could be a culture of loud families. So that could be Jewish, Italian, Greek, sometimes Catholic, but usually the Catholic noise isn't quite the same kind of noise. But so I'd love to hear an experience you had, some story in that context that you found something in common with people that you might otherwise not have found something in common if it weren't for that cultural connection.
So, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is actually going back before high school, really. But you know, my best bud in junior high, which I guess now these days is middle school, I'm told. But
Right.
my best bud was a guy named Paul Serrano, Italian through and through. And I remember going to his house and walking in, and his mom was making something, and it was just the food, and we bonded over the food. And it's funny you bring up these different cultures. In Jewish culture and Italian and Greek, what's one of the core elements of those cultures? It's food and celebrations around food. So, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I love that. Yep. And that's the first thing that would come to mind for me as well. It's even 2 weeks ago, I recorded a podcast with a woman that I otherwise would have zero in common, Shakita Yarborough, that I met at the Atlanta airport, I think. And we had that in common, that we loved to feed people. It was all about nourishing people at our dining room table.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool. I like the idea of commonalities. And it's funny you bring up dog lovers, because you think about that. You find out, oh, so-and-so is a dog. Like, I'm a dog person. I'm definitely a dog person. But you find out, oh, you're a dog person too. And immediately you have that connection. And it's very surface, but still you have that connection. You have that commonality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the thing that's fascinating me about this conversation, this idea, is I recently had a Facebook interaction where I shared something somewhat political, which I don't do very often, but this was in relation to something that's coming up that I'm going to have to vote on here pretty soon. And it's increasing the tobacco tax in the state of Montana. And the way that I put it was, if Big Tobacco is going to spend $1 million a day fighting this, or a week fighting this initiative, then that is a good cue that it's something I should vote for. And that was the premise, was if Big Tobacco is fighting it at that rate, they're not fighting it because it's going to be bad for me. They're fighting it because it's going to be bad for them. Yeah, it's all about the money. But the way that I posted it was that that's how I was looking at it. And I didn't say specifically that this is about them and it's not about what's best for me or all of Montana. And so somebody came up and said, well, how can you vote based on who's fighting a bill? And instead of making that the discussion, which immediately devolves into a political, um, polarized conversation, if I had addressed it as, we all have this in common, we all want affordable health care for us and for our neighbors, and we all want to make sure that if people are going to give up smoking, that they do give up smoking because it's bad for everybody, not just the person who's smoking. If we had talked about the health of our communities rather than making it this, I have this perspective and this person has the opposite perspective, I think maybe our communication could really vastly improve.
For sure. So, I mean, this, at the risk of taking this slightly off track, right? This makes me think of communicating in a convincing way, right? When you're convincing, what does that mean? You're persuasive, I guess, right? So if I'm being persuasive, there are all these tactics out there on how to be persuasive, and there's brain science behind a lot of different things. Put contrast in your stories, use the hero journey, right? All of these different things. But the most convincing, the best way to be convincing is to just meet your audience where they are and have a conversation where it's about us, not about you and what I can do for you, but about us. And so the first step that I'll teach my clients is understand your audience. Before you start messaging, before you start going after someone to buy what you have to meet them where they are. You have to understand their mindset. You have to truly understand their problems and really instill that trust by showing understanding. And it's the same sort of thing. It's having a political discussion. It's taking that outside in approach. It's looking at it from the other person's perspective. It's being a part of that culture. And once you're a part of that and you understand it, you have that bond. Well, that's when you're going to be convincing.
Right, exactly. And there's so much more to that in terms of why you want it to be convincing, or, what is your motivation behind it? And I think that's sometimes a really hard thing for people who want to sell something or who want people to believe what they believe is, how is this going to benefit that person? I mean, it really has to be more selfless. Just like me finding out that big tobacco is spending all this money, that immediately gives me that icky feeling.
Yeah, the icky.
Yeah. So if they knew that so many people were going to look at this and go, you guys are assholes, that it's possible they would take a different approach. And so I think about the fact that how you're perceived matters in terms of your intention behind being persuasive. Am I being persuasive for the sake of selling you something? Or am I being persuasive because I think it's important that you understand this perspective, that this product is going to help you in some way?
That's where, and this has become such a buzzword, and I'm starting to dislike this word, but that's where authenticity comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What's the reason for selling this? And if you're honest and authentic, behind doing that, if you have that authenticity behind what you're trying to sell, if you have that belief, and it's not a belief in your product, it's a belief that this is going to help. That's what it is. I have a background in product marketing, and the thing that I've always needed to have to really be effective is a belief that the thing that I'm marketing is great, that this thing, I believe in this thing. I believe that this is going to help people. It's going to, depending on what it was, I did some healthcare work. It can save lives. Well, I have to believe that. If I'm going to sell it, I have to believe it.
Right. And I don't think everybody feels that way, unfortunately, which is why we have a lot of obnoxious products out there that don't help anybody.
Yeah, you can usually figure that out, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's interesting is that you talk this through, and it all comes back to your culture as well, and how you grew up. What are your values? And I think about Chris Spurvey's book, It's Time to Sell. And his premise is similar to that, in that you have to use what you're good at to be good at anything. So in sales, if you are not somebody who is really good at going out and shaking hands and pounding the pavement, that doesn't mean you're not going to be a good salesperson. It just means that you have to figure out what your strengths are and use those to do your sales. And it comes back to the way that you and I communicate and the culture that we grew up with, which was being authentic and caring about the person in front of us. And that plays a huge role in our success. But also the fact that we are always looking for commonalities. So I'm thinking about a story that happened many years ago. I love small world stories. I'm a big small world stories person. And many years ago, I was in Colorado for my brother's birthday party. I had left the kids at home, flown from Montana to Denver. My sister flew in by herself from California into Denver. And we were out partying. I mean, it was a wild night. And my brother is kind of a celebrity in Denver. Everybody knows who Eric is. And we were out doing a pub crawl. We're going from bar to bar with 50 of his closest friends, meeting us at different bars all along our route. And at some point, he introduced me to his friend, Jeff. And he said, Sarah, I want you to meet my friend, Jeff Cass. And I said, Katz? He said, no, Cass. And I said, with a K? He said, yes. I said, well, that's kind of an unusual name. My first boyfriend in 5th grade, his last name was Cass. And he said, oh, that's interesting. And kind of, he was going to move on. And I said, okay, I just have to ask this. I'm sure that the shots of Tawaka had something to do with this particular question. But I looked at him and I said, so did you grow up here in Denver? And he said, no, I grew up in LA. And I said, okay, I'm just going to take this to the next step. I went to Canterbury Elementary School, and my first boyfriend in 5th grade was Brian Cass. He said, that's my little brother.
That's awesome.
Right. And I remember not sure I should believe him. I remember looking at him and being not quite sure. But it was him. And he told me about Brian's life, that he had finished grad school and went to medical school and was a doctor in Albuquerque. And, you know, the joke came up, you could have married a doctor. And I said, in Albuquerque? Oh, I want to be in Albuquerque. But it was a big laugh. We had a great time. And I remember being a little puzzled the next day as I'm processing what had happened, because what this meant was that my brother had worked with Jeff. Jeff is a year older than my brother. They had worked together with the Denver newspaper agency for years, and they never knew they went to the same elementary school.
That's wild.
Right.
That's wild.
And I think part of what makes persuasive communication is asking those questions.
Sure. Well, you know, tie it back to culture, you know, at least in American Judaism, you always play Jewish geography, right?
Right.
So, right? So it's oh, you grew up there. Hey, do you know so-and-so? And I grew up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and Cherry Hill, New Jersey is a fairly Jewish area. And everybody knows Cherry Hill, New Jersey. If you're an American Jew, you know Cherry Hill, New Jersey. You just do. And so
Right.
it's I always get, oh, Cherry Hill. Oh, do you know Josh Cohen?
Which there only have to be like a dozen of them, right?
A bazillion. Yeah. But it's that's another piece. Geography becomes a huge piece of that culturalism, of that commonality. Just finding
Definitely.
people and people you know from different places. And yeah, it's pretty wild.
And if we only started conversations like that, and using whatever aspect of our culture we might be able to see in front of us that person may share. And it's not that hard to observe those details. When I was giving a keynote last week, I looked out to the audience and I told a story that involved kids and dogs. And I knew 90% of the people in that room would be able to relate to one or the other or both.
Sure.
And I don't know if I guess it comes back to culture, because I have a dog household And there is definitely a culture around people who have dogs and love dogs. There's a culture of parenthood, of sharing those stories with people who have children. No matter how old or young they are, there's always that commonality. And so I bring it back to the word culture, because it's really about it's not about the aspect of having a child. It's the aspect of growing a child and all that goes into that, or a dog for that matter, for the fur babies.
Yeah. Oh, I dig that. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, ooh, culture, like a yogurt culture, and it starts to grow and it starts to form different things. And that's really cool. It's a really neat way of looking at that word.
Yeah, I think that's going to take some processing,
Yeah,
so to speak.
I dig that.
So tell me another story, something related to either a small world story or the way that you understand you put your culture into a conversation.
This isn't culture. This is a small world story. It's amazing to me. Maybe it's culture, because this guy was Italian, but whatever. So when I was a kid, we used to go to the beach all the time. Well, not all the time, but every summer we'd go to the beach, down the shore. It was Jersey, for a week or two every summer. And we went to Long Beach Island. And I remember I was 14. And when I was 14, man, I was like the stereotypical, like, geeky, gangly 14-year-old. I had the braces, I had the glasses, my legs were longer than they should be. I had ginormous, when I was 14, I had size 15 feet, which is where I started. I was a sight to be seen. But
like one of those puppies with the gigantic feet.
Oh yeah. And then maybe that's probably the reason, getting back to that first story, probably the reason why I was so shy, because I was not at all confident. And I met this guy that summer at the beach, and Neil Giordano was his name, and I never forgot his name. And I remember he was from, now the name of the city's leaving me, but I remembered the name of the city for a long time. I used to remember this. And Dobbs Ferry. He was from Dobbs Ferry, New York. And we had a great time that week. We had a great time. We just hung out, had a great time. And I remember, and there's a side story off of this, but I'll get to that in a bit if we have time. So we had a great time. That was it. Went home, that was it. Thought of Neil occasionally once and then again, and whatever, I'm sure he did. This is way pre-internet. So fast forward to a few years ago, Facebook. And for whatever reason, I'm going to look up Neil Giordano. And and there he is. And so I called him up, and I said to him, and he answered the phone. I said, you're not you might not remember this, but do you remember going to the beach? It was probably in the mid 80s in Jersey, and you hung out with this guy. We hung out and had a good time and everything. And he's like, Zach? And it was crazy. So anyway, the side story there, and this was nuts too. You talk about small world. That week at the beach, there was a girl who was living in the apartment above us. It was a duplex house. Living in the apartment above us, it was like the owner's daughter or granddaughter or something. I remembered her name, like, for a while. Like, I was crushing on this girl. Oh my goodness. And same thing, like, you're at the beach, whatever. It was that same summer. And fast forward, then I was in college, and I sang in an a cappella group in college. And we had a performance. We invited all these different a cappella groups in from around the country, really mostly around Boston area, but around the country. And she was in one of the groups. It was crazy.
And you recognized her?
I totally recognized her. I was like, oh my God, I know that person. Who is that person? And one of my friends knew someone there, and I asked my friend, and they said, oh yeah. It's crazy. It was crazy.
Wow. Yeah. especially with the millions of people on the East Coast. Like if that happened in Montana, it wouldn't be that surprising.
Not really. See, I'm kind of killing this for you though, Sarah, because not really culture so much, but just small world. It's just crazy.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that we make those connections partly because of our culture, partly because we find something in common with them. So you and Neil, even though he was Italian, you're Jewish, you definitely had a lot in common in terms of how you were raised and the culture that you were raised in. I think of all the ethnicities and cultures that could be really very much in common, it would be the Italian and Jewish cultures. I mean, watch Moonstruck.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I love that movie because it feels like home to me, even though we're not Italian. I mean, I don't have any Italian in me, but when I see the mother and the grandparents and how they all interact with the kids and grown children that still you regress to your childhood when you're around grandmother and your mother because you can't help yourself. That is all, I mean, that's family. And when I find other people that have that in common, it's almost always somebody who's Italian or Jewish. Almost
well,
always.
It's funny. One of the things that I've had to work really hard on as an adult and as someone in the communications field is truly listening. Not jumping in, not formulating what I'm going to say next, but truly being present and listening. And I think that's incredibly cultural because in our house, especially when we had, there was a holiday and Jewish holidays, it's food and family and
noise,
lots and lots of noise and lots of conversation. And you had to jump to get your point in. You had to fight to get your point in because you picture, a dozen, 24 people sitting around a table, all having a conversation together, not different conversations, but a conversation. And the back and the forth and the this one saying this and this. If you have a point to make, you better make it. You got to jump in and make it because if you don't, it's gone. And that was instilled in me for a long time. Still is.
Yeah, and that is something that we have to fight in our culture, in our background, is that urge to just say something, especially when what we have to say may not add any actual value to the conversation.
That's right.
And that's something that I've had to learn over the years because I had difficult work situations where my boss would be somebody who really wouldn't appreciate it when I would speak up. And so I had to really think about what I was going to say and how I was going to present it, because I had to decide, is this going to add to the conversation? Is this just going to exacerbate a problem? Or is it something that's really important for me to bring up? And that's hard because, like you said, culturally, my instinct is to just say what I'm thinking. And that's definitely something that I've had to fight. And at the same time, I'm finding that sometimes that's a strength, because when nobody else will speak up, I don't have a problem speaking up. Yeah. So that's, again, I think it's not just a personality thing. I think it's a cultural thing.
They're intertwined for sure. Nature versus nurture. I mean, the environment that you grow up in shapes so much of who you end up being.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And that's part of how we can be closer to other humans, is recognizing that.
For sure.
Communicating in a way that acknowledges what we have in common.
I was at a conference last week, and one of the things that was talked about was, I think it's a quote from Steve Jobs, but he talks about, see how things connect by looking backwards, not by looking forwards. And you don't know how your dots are going to connect until you've already experienced them and you have the dot. And I think that culture gives you similar or the same dots in certain respects. And that's why when you look back over your experience and someone else is looking back over theirs, and it's figurative, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you have commonalities because of those experiences and because of how you've been brought up, or how the different things that have happened to you because you've been in these different situations or these different places with the perspective that you have.
It ties back into how we communicate with people and understanding the lenses we wear when we're talking to somebody, and being aware that they have their own lenses, and that when you find something in common, then your perception or your perspective can turn toward each other as opposed to away from each other.
For sure. And I think typically when you have perspectives that turn away from each other, it's because people aren't making the effort to learn the other perspective. And they're because of preconceived notions, because of their own experience, perhaps, they're not willing to listen when they're in a certain situation.
Right.
You know,
And
politics,
I definitely do
politics
that.
politics is the greatest example of this. Politics today, especially in the United States, that's the
Right.
greatest example of it.
And
Because
the
you have people
question,
that feel super strongly on either side of the
Mhm.
of any particular issue, and they're not willing to listen. Both sides not willing to
right.
listen, not willing to take the perspective of the other person,
Mhm.
and that's really what's necessary to do.
Well, and when I was thinking back to that Facebook conversation I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, this Facebook back and forth about this tobacco tax, when I was frustrated with it, my first thought was, I should ask him what, if anything, I could say or show to him to change his mind. And if not, if there's nothing that would change his mind, then we don't need to be having this conversation because the mind is closed off. But in that same moment, as I'm thinking about writing this question to him on a private message, not in this public forum, I thought, well, Sarah, what could he say to you that might
Yeah.
change your mind? Because it's not fair to just ask that one-sided question. And I looked at it and I thought, well, there may be some things that he could show me, real data, that would change my mind. Real data, and not something that was made up or that he heard, or the thing that came on a flyer that was paid for by the tobacco industry. And I thought, okay, there is something that he could show me that I would consider changing my mind. And that kind of opened a different opportunity for me in my conversations with him.
Cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
Most people won't take that perspective.
Yeah, I think
Maybe
that's
that's too big a generalization. Maybe it's not, but my feeling is most people will not take that perspective.
and maybe it's just because we're not asking the right questions.
It could be. It could be. Also, I mean, when things get emotionally charged too, I mean, if emotion's in there, I mean,
Our
that's,
first response is to be defensive.
yeah, it's fight
Yeah.
or flight.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a friendly? Is this not a friendly? You know, friend or foe?
Mm-hmm. And we surround ourselves with people like us, which comes back to the culture thing.
For sure.
And I look at my Facebook, the responses of the majority of my Facebook friends are all in favor of what I said. And they came in full force to talk to this person. And at first it seemed very reasonable, but then of course it devolved because we weren't asking questions. We were making statements. And there's no way we're going to find commonality by making statements. There's no way. That's never going to happen.
That's right.
I could say, I love my dog. I just made a statement. Is that actually going to find commonality?
Maybe
No.
with other people that love your dog.
Right. But if I say, I have this great dog and I just took him for a hike, do you have a pet? And I ask them a question
Totally
as opposed
different.
to making a statement. It's a totally different relationship.
Totally different.
Immediately.
Absolutely. Because you're involving someone in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because now it's not, I have this. It's I've experienced this. Have you? I've experienced this, and it's been wonderful for me. What's your experience with it? You're taking an interest in the other person.
Mm-hmm. And you're sharing a little bit of your own story while still asking a question and opening that conversation. Because it develops a relationship. Wow. I'm thinking about so much right now in how this conversation may impact my relationships with people who I am on opposite sides of the fence of politically and in any environment, really. This is going to take some time to process, I think.
Sure. Well, I mean, the thing that I always like to ask myself, not somebody else, but ask myself, I rarely get into political conversations. I rarely do. And I'm pretty center of the road politically. But when I do, if I'm in a conversation and it gets heated, or if we truly disagree, the thing I want to uncover is why. Why does this person feel this way, where I feel so strongly the other way? Why do they feel this way? What's happened? Why, and sometimes it's even people that you grow up in a similar place. You grow up in a similar type of house. Sometimes maybe it is, or maybe it isn't culture, but it's why is this person think this way? What are the reasons? What has happened in their life?
Exactly.
How have they processed different information? What have they been exposed to? Why do they think this way? Because that gives you added perspective to start thinking, okay, well, why do I, as you point out, why do I feel this way?
What did I read?
Exactly.
What experience did I have that drew me to this conclusion?
Well, I read something, I think it might have been a Mike Johnson quote or piece, or maybe it was even him talking, but it said, nobody these days has an opinion. Their opinion is made for them based on what they read. And that was striking to me. And it made me really consider, okay, what do I think about X, Y, or Z? And think of what am I influenced by? What are the things out there that I've read? Why do I feel the way or think the way that I think?
Where am I getting my information, and why do I trust it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So back to this whole question about how we connect with people so that we can better understand where they're coming from. I think as we kind of come full circle back to the beginning of our conversation, if we want to be persuasive, we have to ask certain questions, and we have to ask some of ourselves as well. And we have to find what's in common. It's funny because the piece that keeps coming back to me is when I was facilitating conversations among faculty and staff at the Montana University system, the first thing I would do is I would ask the people in the room what their purpose was for teaching. And I would ask them all, what do you have in common? You all want students to be successful, no matter what school they go to. You want them to learn, you want them to develop their own thought processes. And I would write down on a whiteboard or on a flip chart the 3 top things that came up in terms of what they had in common. And then anytime some sort of argument would come up or something that was more of a conflict, I would point back to those 3 things and say, okay, how do those fit in with this conversation? And I'm looking back thinking, I was applying all this in those environments, but I'm not applying it to my everyday conversations. Why not?
It's hard to do.
It is hard to do, especially
And especially
in the platforms that we have.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And when things get emotionally charged, then it's even tougher to do.
But it's the right thing to do.
For sure, it's the right thing to do. Well, that's how you get that understanding. I mean, that's kind of the basis behind buyer personas in marketing. What are the core ideas that bind this group together? What are the core values? What are their cares? What are their hopes and dreams? What are their pains? What are they worried about? It's large groups of people.
You know what I love about that, Zach? I love that all of those questions you ask in terms of a buyer persona, all of them have to do with human traits and human values that have nothing to do with generalizations necessarily. So you're not talking about is the age range of my potential buyer, the gender, the sexual orientation, the religious background, the education level. You know, you're not separating people by what I consider relatively arbitrary things. And you are identifying them by what they have in common in terms of their values and what they care about. And that's, I love that. Now that's something I could get behind, because I never figured out who's my audience. I would try to kind of have that avatar of my ideal client, but I could never get around the idea that I never know what's going to resonate with whom.
I just had this conversation with someone. You know, this is the conference I was at last week, actually. So one of the things that, I launched my own thing about a year ago, and I had pretty grand plans, and I couldn't figure out who my customer avatar was. You know, I came out of B2B technology marketer. I thought that was my audience, and I don't think that's really my audience. And then I thought, oh, entrepreneurs, small business owners, I dig that. I like making a difference. And these are people that think of marketing in a way that I believe doesn't really exist or doesn't really work anymore. And I started doing interviews with entrepreneurs and quickly got discouraged. And that became my barrier. So I'm at this conference, and it's a conference with 7 and 8 figure entrepreneurs. And we're sitting in tables. And one of the things that we had to do was talk about what we do. Who are you? What do you do? Who do you serve? And what's your biggest challenge right now? How can we help you? And I started talking about this challenge. And the guy sitting next to me said to me, got to make a list. What are the attributes of the ideal client for you? Forget who they are. Forget where they work or what industry. What are their attributes? And I never thought of it that way. I thought about it that way when building buyer personas, but I never thought about it for myself and for my own audience. And I put that together, and I very quickly realized that the audience that I wanted to work with was in that room. It was all the people in that room. And what I know of entrepreneurs, what I know of really much of the business to business technology, enterprise technology world, is they are trapped in this world of old school marketing. And old school could be 2 or 3 years old, but it's old school marketing. And it is those demographics. And it is, I mean, to a certain extent, it's psychographics and how people look, how people look at things and that sort of thing. But largely the difference between how things are mostly done and the way that I look at things being done is it's feeling. How do they feel about things, right? So it's not, gender plays a part in that to a certain extent, sort of, kind of.
Less and
religion plays less and less, I think, too. Mm-hmm. Religion, too, less and less, plays a certain part of upbringing, how much money you have, all of that plays a piece in that. But it's much more individualized. And it comes back to me, where is it? This thing. I'm holding my phone. right? When the iPhone was launched, I'm sure we've talked about this. I probably talked about this at NLV. When the iPhone was launched in 2007, everything changed, and it went from a world where it was all demographics and looking at these numbers and figuring out, okay, I'm looking at this customer segment and here's who they are. Blah, 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 blah. You know, it's our customer is Bob, and Bob is a male, and he's 47.2 years old, and
Your
he has
avatar.
2.6 kids, and they, yeah. But what this did, what that iPhone did, is it flipped power in the buyer-seller relationship, or the seller-buyer relationship, where as the buyer now, the buyer holds the power. The buyer is completely empowered. And especially you think of today's world where this is the selfie world. You know, it's me. And if you're messaging, if you're putting marketing out there that's focused on you, on your product, you're missing it. If you're putting marketing that's out there focused on Bob, who's a 40 whatever year old man with 2.6 kids, and you're missing it. You're missing it. It's not about who Bob is. It's about how Bob feels. And it's about how Bob feels. And I just realized I'm saying Bob. That's really funny.
Since that's my husband's name.
It's about how Bob feels and how he will feel using your product. And that's a very different message that's put out there than the one that used to be.
Right. Yeah. You just can't generalize your messaging in the same way that you used to.
No,
it just doesn't
absolutely
work
right.
that way.
Absolutely right. Well, that's why people say that's why people say in marketing, you have to find your niche, because then it's much easier. You know, it's much easier to market to a smaller
And it
group.
comes back to, again, figuring out the culture that you have in common.
That's right.
Because I can identify people that have similar values to me. And that often comes with questions about what we have in common. And do I want to work with people who don't value certain aspects of humanity? Probably not. Am I going to work with somebody that I consider to be greedy or self-absorbed? That's probably not my audience. I don't want to work with clients like that. So I don't want to work with people who necessarily have the same political views as me. But I definitely want those common core values, caring about other humans. That has to be part of it. Curiosity, it has to be part of it. So, and the way that I can identify those people is simply by asking them questions about what we have in common, or what they think that may be different from me, and figuring out why culturally they may think that way. There's
so many layers to this.
I know, I love it. We could go on and on, but we probably shouldn't. My dog's waiting over here for a walk, so.
Well, thanks so much.
This has been great. Zach, I'm going to go back through and probably listen to this a couple times to try to process some of what we talked about, particularly when we talked about culture as an interest, as a lifestyle, as opposed to the traditional definition of culture. That there is a dog people culture, there's a cat people culture, and you can't fit into just one. There's so many of them, and that's the beauty of it. I love that.
You know what it's kind of like? It's kind of like, and I'm going to show my colors from back in middle school and high school. It reminds me a little of Dungeons and Dragons characters, because in D&D, you have these characters and you build them up, right? They have different attributes, and they have attributes for their intelligence and their strength and their wisdom and how fast, dexterity and whatever. But they're also, you build up you build the character. Who are they? What's their background? Why do they react a certain way in certain situations? What's the story there? And there are lots of layers to it. And I've started recently looking at things kind of through a lens of games. like if my life is a video game, right? Or if I do this, if I pull this lever over here, what's going to happen? What's the result going to be? How many lives do I have? But it's interesting because when you talk about dog person, or, he's Italian and he's a dog person and he's from Oklahoma and he's from, you put all these different layers in and you start to build this and you realize how many different cultures any one person can really be a part of.
A lot. I don't think there's a limit.
No,
I don't think there's a limit, especially if you're really curious.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I love curious. That's my favorite word right now. Curious. Zach, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me for this podcast. I am looking forward to hearing feedback from our listeners. We were kind of all over the place, but it definitely all came back to how we communicate and the benefits of asking questions to really better understand how we can connect and find our commonalities.
I love it, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?